Guzik notes in Roman numeral I, quote from Ironside, able chronologists have shown that the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ occurred immediately after the expiration of 483 prophetic years of 360 days each from the time of Artaxerxes' order. Remember that time frame that I was showing you? Let's go back to that real quick. This one. Notice in this version, the second decree of Artaxerxes was in the 444 time frame. Some charts say 445, so 444, 45, somewhere around there. Others say that it was the earlier time frame. See, notice this one says 445. Others have, like, for instance, Brother Alan Parr here, who's a Christian YouTuber, he opts for the earlier date of 457, which is still an Artaxerxes decree, but it's an earlier one given to Ezra rather than the later one that was given to Nehemiah, like we see in this chart. So either way, we're getting very close to allowing for a certain amount of time to pass by before Jesus himself makes a prominent scene in the first century Israel time frame, which is what the what's being highlighted by Guzik here. Another quote by Baldwin. Strangely, many commentators simply ignore these numbers. The numbers are symbolic, not arithmetical. And then Roman numeral 3, cut off is a poignant description of Jesus' earthly life up to and including the cross. This is a quote from Heslop. Born in another man's stable, cradled in another man's manger, with nowhere to lay his head during his life on earth, and buried in another man's tomb after dying on a cursed cross, the Christ of God and the friend of the friendless was indeed cut off and had nothing. Remember, keep in mind that this passage about this anointed person being cut off in Christian circles is normally and rightfully associated with Yeshua, Jesus, the one who came in the first century and declared himself to be the Messiah after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Notice also before that he had kept himself hidden. He would heal people and tell them, hey, don't go around telling everyone who healed you. Don't say anything. He would charge people, don't say anything, because he knew that his time was not yet to reveal himself publicly. But at the time at the recording of the time where he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, what we often call Palm Sunday, is the time frame when he finally revealed himself publicly. And we know that, of course, at his trial, when they asked him point blank, are you the Messiah? Right, when the high priest questioned him, are you he? Are you the one? Yeshua answered, yes, I'm the one. I am the one that will come on I'm the one that you will see coming on the clouds, the Son of Man, et cetera, et cetera. He plugged himself right into those prophecies. So by that point in time, he was openly revealing and professing himself to be the Messiah. But before that, he kept himself hidden. So this is why it seems to coincide with his arrival or triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which is why Christians like that 444 or 445 or 457 date, give or take 12 years there. They like that date because it says after this time period, when the Messiah shows up and then he will be cut off. This idea of him going to the cross and dying and being cut off is outside of the 400 and let me pull up that time frame again. It's outside of the 434 years. So it's after the 483 years itself, which is why the Christian translations say after the 62 weeks, right? Remember, if you look at that time period again, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. But the 62-week time period came after the 7 weeks. So really what Daniel's trying to say is after the 483 years, then the Messiah will be cut off. You guys understanding what I'm saying? Even though Daniel's 9:26 says, after 62 weeks shall Messiah cut off. But the 62 already came after the 7. That's the point I'm trying to make. So let's just pull up the verse again. Then after the 62 weeks, right? But the 62 weeks came after the 7 weeks. So we're talking about after 434 years, including, in addition to the 49 years. So we have both of those time frames. Let's see what else happens. Shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So the one who comes later shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. After the Messiah was cut off, Jerusalem and her temple would be destroyed again by an overwhelming army with a flood. Most of all, Bible scholars and commentators agree that this was fulfilled in the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. This is where the details of Daniel's prophecy really jump off the page for the preterists, because when we're talking about the destruction of the city and the sanctuary, there's a time frame that must be the first century. Nearly every single author that I have consulted on this particular verse and this particular clause of this prophecy agree that this is the destruction of the city and the sanctuary in the 70 AD time frame. So even standard Jewish authorities agree that this is talking about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, which everyone knows by modern time reckoning that this was the destruction that stopped any other temples from being rebuilt. So now we're looking at a destruction that for the last 2,000 years has not been rectified. We're talking about a destroyed temple that never got rebuilt. So the destruction of the temple here is more or less almost a final destruction, which gives the preterists the perspective that they carry, which is that God is done with Israel up to this point, and now he's dealing with the church by and large, and that's why all of Daniel's prophecies must be interpreted within the first century time frame. 70 AD, and then the 130s with the destruction of Jerusalem itself and the plowing under and the kicking out of the Jews. After the Messiah was cut off, it's important to notice that this time frame has parameters that include Messiah being cut off after the 62 weeks, and then we have this destruction of the sanctuary taking place also after the 62 weeks. And that is important because it shows us that Daniel, even though he didn't see what we might call this 2,000 year long church gap. Let me bring up that chart for you one more time. See that gap there on my chart with the bright red arrow pointing up that says church age? Notice that it's labeled AD 70 destruction of Jerusalem. We got the big cross there where it shows Messiah being cut off around 33 AD. The cutoff here refers to not just the fact that Messiah was executed by the Romans, but cut off also in the sense that from a Jewish perspective, he was rejected by his people. He was sent into exile, as it were, from the Jewish people. He was rejected by the Jewish people, in that sense, cut off. His lineage came to an end, right? He didn't have any seed following after him, no children following after him, in that sense, cut off also. But Messiah was executed. But notice that the gap on this chart takes place after the 483 years, but before the final 7 years. So if Daniel says in his prophecy, after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, then that phrase, the very first clause in Daniel's prophecy here, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. What this tells us is that these events that are being described in verse 26 are actually inside of the gap. Does that make sense? At least from the normative reading of the text. Because then in verse 27 it says, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. So there's where the 7 years begins its count again. But taken in its normative sense, we have this Messiah being cut off, the people of the prince destroying the city and the sanctuary, and the end coming with a flood, and there'll be war, desolations, etc. History reveals that the events of verse 26 didn't transpire overnight. Even if you took Messiah being cut off, his death on the cross being the end of the 62 weeks, or his death must be after the 62 weeks, right? Meaning the 62 weeks goes by, and then shortly after that, he's cut off, which is the interpretation that I'm going with. Nevertheless, we would have to agree that the events that we're reading about here, about the people, the prince who comes, the destruction of the city, the flood and all that stuff, all of that didn't take place in one night. It transpired over a period of months and years. And so most people would agree, even if the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the city itself wasn't destroyed completely or plowed under until up closer to the 130s, right, with the Bar Kokhba revolt and things like that. So what's the point I'm trying to bring up is that Daniel, probably without even realizing it, was actually describing events that we now know in hindsight. Remember that confirmation bias? We now know in hindsight, historically, occurred or transpired inside of the gap, inside of that church age gap. Now, the preterists are going to say, well, this was a very, very short gap. If any gap at all, it was very, very short. But the preterists have to agree that there was some gap, at least, the siege of Jerusalem with Titus and his armies, even that took place over a period of like 6 or 8 months or something to that effect. It wasn't instantaneous. It was drawn out itself. So even the preterists would have to say, well, there's still a little bit of gap, but how big do we make the gap? That's the point I'm trying to highlight. So let's go back over to David Guzik. Shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. After the Messiah was cut off, Jerusalem and her temple would be destroyed again by an overwhelming army with a flood. Most all Bible scholars and commentators agree that this was fulfilled in the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. This is also rather striking because from Daniel's perspective, who was living still in the exile period of Babylon, Daniel was foretold that Jerusalem would be built and that the temple would be rebuilt. But now Daniel's also being foretold that Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed. And yet, when we get to verse 27, which I hope to get to tonight, we're going to see that there must be some temple that's rebuilt again, because notice what it said in verse 27. He'll make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he'll put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolation. Well, this is temple language. Sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abomination, wing there, the extremity of the temple, etc., etc. Well, if the temple just got destroyed in verse 26, what's all this temple language in 27? So Daniel, I believe, is being foretold the rebuilding of another temple, right? At least if we take the language of 26 and 27 in its most natural sense. All right, let's go back up to verse 26. So David Guzik talks about the destruction of the temple and the Roman authorities being the ones who execute or who brought that into reality. Notice point number C, the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy, right? The destroying army is made up of the people of the prince who's to come. This coming prince is described more in Daniel 9:27. What we're also going to be seeing when we finally turn to verse 27 and the 70th week of Daniel, eventually turn into it more pointedly, is we're going to have to start dealing with who is this prince or who is this person who confirms a covenant. Is it Jesus who confirms his covenant with the many? Is it the Antichrist, right? Antiochus Epiphanes that we've heard about historically, the one who showed up in the 2 centuries prior to Jesus, right? During the time period of the Maccabees, and he defiled the temple and made a covenant with the people. Is that the person? Or is it a future Antichrist that's still around the corner? We haven't seen him yet. He's going to make a covenant with the Jewish people and her neighbors for the 7-year time period. Is he going to be the one? And all of that is done within the context of who is the people of the prince who's to come. The Greek and the Hebrew use words that are similar to one another when we talk about prince in verse 26 and the he in verse 27, which is the immediate antecedent of the pronoun there. Who's the he? Is the he the people? Is it the prince? Is it the Messiah, the one? So those are some of the questions that we're going to have to start entertaining here. But first, as we finish up looking at verse 26, we see that the people of the prince who's to come shall destroy. According to Daniel, it's not this prince who destroyed the city or who destroyed the temple. Let me read the prophecy entirely. It says, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Using historical events as our confirmation along with the Bible, we know that Titus, right, the son of Vespasian, the emperor, so that would make Titus a prince, by the way, since his father was an emperor. This makes, by way of title, Titus becomes a prince. So this fits also as well. The people of the prince who is to come, let's say this is Vespasian. Let's say this is Titus, son of Vespasian. So Titus, who is the prince who is to come, which I think is a very good possibility, strong possibility, and indeed it's the interpretation that I'm going to go with as a futurist. It says the people of the prince. Well, if Titus is a Roman, then who are his people? His people would be the Roman soldiers, or the Roman group, the legion that was underneath his command. And sure enough, history shows that Titus himself didn't want to destroy the temple. He tried to save it. You can read about this not just in your history books, but you can read about it in Josephus as well, who was a historian who lived at that time period. So Josephus also confirms that Titus didn't want to destroy the temple. Once he got in there and saw all of the beautiful gold and the structure itself, the ornate objects and stuff, the furniture, he said, let's keep all this, right? But because of what we might call mob mentality of the soldiers and the kind of the adrenaline rush of destruction that comes on when you're rushing an enemy, well, then they overwhelmed even his own orders not to destroy it, and it just got destroyed by not Titus, but by the people who were underneath his command, the soldiers and the whole crowd itself. And so just like Yeshua prophesied that not one of these stones would be left unturned, and we'll get to those prophecies in time in Matthew and Mark and in Luke, the prophecies about the destruction of the temple. Well, sure enough, history confirms that, not counting the supporting wall that's left standing today, which is known as the Western Wall, but everything above that was razed to the ground by the people of the prince who came from Daniel's perspective when we say future, the prince who's to come. So that's the fulfillment of that particular part of this prophecy. Notice it also says, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined. That seems to be kind of an overview type of statement about the end of the city and the sanctuary with a flood. There actually was a flood, a physical flood that took place during that time period. And then it says, even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined. We know that the events of 70 AD were events that not only Yeshua foretold would happen and that history confirms did happen, but from a futurist perspective, we see that these prophecies could be repeated by a future rebuilt temple, or at least some type of rebuilt sacrificing edifice like a sanctuary, or at least an altar, a holy of holies type object of furniture, or room or something where sacrifices can be poured out. And then according to the futurist perspective, we see that there's kind of a bit of a now and not yet, or near and far aspect. Remember the prophetic telescoping image that I kept flashing on the screen from several weeks back, that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed again. And so we can see that perhaps parts of these prophecies can be recycled, as it were, be reused, where Jerusalem's going to be destroyed once again. We know from reading other Old Testament prophecies that there's language about Jerusalem suffering at the hands of Gentiles and things like that. Let's keep reading Pastor David Guzik. Let's now turn to verse 27 and begin to look at this final 70th week. What I'll do is I'll probably end out tonight by reading Pastor Guzik's commentary here, and then next week we'll actually have different material that's specifically dedicated to the 70th week. We'll have more charts that have a zoomed in perspective of the events of the 70th week. We'll begin to look at the 70th week from the perspective of the 3.5 and the 3.5 years. And from a futurist perspective, what details should we expect to take place in the 70th week now that we've done kind of the overview. So tonight we'll finish the overview of the 70 weeks to include the 70th, the final week. And then next week we'll actually turn into the 70 weeks, the 70th week, specifically just that last 7 years, what Christians know as the 7-year tribulation, etc. Okay, so Pastor Guzik's point number 5, which is verse 27, the events of the 70th week. Then he, here's his quote from the Bible, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even unto the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Okay, let's begin to break it down. Point A, he shall confirm a covenant. According to Guzik's quote here, the he Gabriel described is the prince who is to come mentioned in the previous verse. If we know that the prince's people destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, then we know this coming prince has his ancestral roots in the soil of the ancient Roman Empire. Now let me interject. The interpretation that and comment that Pastor Guzik just supplied is a very well-known and well-accepted interpretation, and I think it has a little bit of merit as well, but I want to interject that there are other ways to view this. When we talk about he confirming a covenant, the immediate preceding nouns were either the prince or the Messiah earlier or the people, right? We're not exactly sure. It could be any one of those. Daniel just abruptly starts verse 26 with, and he. And owing to the fact that the original writing of Daniel wasn't broken down into verses, well, then from Daniel's perspective, who's to say that originally verse 26 and 27 weren't originally intended to be one long verse, right? I mean, if they were one long verse, then the he would have been normally understood within the context of either this prince who is to come or the people or the Messiah that we looked at in verse 25, right? I'm sorry, earlier in 26, the Messiah who's cut off. So there are other possibilities when we're talking about who's the he that's confirmed the covenant. And based on that, different Bible interpreters of today come to the conclusion that this future leader, this prince to come or this Messiah to come, he will either have Roman ancestry or he will have Gentile ancestry. Some Bible teachers even say that he will have maybe Muslim ancestry, right? Looking for a Muslim type of Antichrist. That's an interesting perspective that I think like Joel Richardson takes that perspective. Either way we look at it, we're talking about an individual confirming a covenant. Who is the he and what's this covenant that he's confirming? Let's again begin to look at some of these details. We won't hit all of them tonight. I'm saving some of them until future studies. By the way, when it says he'll have ancestral roots in the soil of ancient empire, the ancient Roman Empire, given the historical reality that it was Titus who destroyed the temple, Titus and his people who destroyed the first century temple, and Titus was definitely a Roman, then we can use that as our launching point to say that if and when there will be a revived Roman Empire, like Daniel seems to suggest from the prophecies that we found in chapter 2 and chapter 7 and now chapter 9. Remember the beasts of chapter 7? Remember the statue of chapter 2? I'll put a little graphic on the screen to help you remind you of that, and I'll bring it up again next week as we start going into the overview. Remember, in those visions and those dreams, we saw that when it came time to describe either the fourth metal, which was the iron in the statue, and the fourth beast in Daniel's dream of chapter 7, that there was this odd sort of now and not yet, or near, far, or partially fulfilled and completely fulfilled feature to that final empire or people group. So when we're talking about an ancient Roman Empire that existed in the time of the first century as the beast empire that was on the scene, then if it's a revived Roman Empire that shows up in the future, then it would seem to make sense because it's simply a continuation of where Daniel left off in his dream, a continuation of where the statue left off with in the legs moving down into the toes. So that's what we're talking about. Roman numeral point 1. Therefore, the prince who is to come will in some way be an heir to the Romans, even as the final world government is an heir to the Roman Empire. Again, knowing that Daniel prophesied events that dealt with world empires, Gentile people groups, and their influence over Israel and her people in that part of the Middle East, then we can say for certain that there have been other people groups, Gentile powers, that have dominated Israel at certain times, and yet during the time of Messiah, during the first century, it was Rome who was in power. So it makes sense for us to see that this Antichrist who's to come, from the future's perspective, will in some way simply pick up where the first century world power left off, right? Ancient Roman Empire, revived Roman Empire, etc., etc. That seems to make more sense. However, the world powers that are in prominence today don't look very Roman, right? We don't see people walking around wearing togas and that funny little hat that the Roman soldiers wore with the fuzzy, the one that Marvin the Martian wears, the little fuzzy mohawk on the top, the red mohawk. I'll flash a little picture and post so you can see what I'm talking about. So when we're talking about a revived Roman Empire, how Roman will it look? It might not look very Roman at all, but the footprint of where ancient Rome ruled, right, the borders, might be what Daniel's really getting at when he's talking about a revived Roman Empire, if indeed that's the interpretation. And so given that possibility of interpretations, we would see some kind of landmass that is equivalent to what we might recognize today as the European Union or Europe, or large parts of Europe. But if we're talking East and West Rome, right? Remember, Rome had East and West. Western Rome would be Europe, but Eastern Rome would be modern day Turkey and those areas right now. So what are we to make of these prophecies? Well, as we're going to begin to get more details, again, when we turn to the 70th week and we start looking more at this Antichrist type of figure, this final ruler, we'll do this next week. I'll bring in some more maps and we'll talk more about how that, given world empires today, we're seeing those who have influential power in and around Israel or near Israel, Iraq and Iran and Lebanon, Turkey, of course, and things like that. These types of world powers. Today, we also have to deal with Islam. What do we make of that world dominance? What do we make of that world power? What do we make of how they're going to be fitting into the end times? So we can't just, the point I'm trying to bring up by all of this rambling, as it were, is that don't just dump everything on, say, on some revived Roman Empire. The details don't seem to flesh out an interpretation that would put everything in the lap of a revived Roman Empire. We have to take into account that much of the Middle East is dominated by what we today would recognize as Islamic powers. So that we have to bring them into discussion, right? I mean, that seems to be the obvious interpretation or I should say, the obvious detail that must be brought to the table if we're going to make sense of some of these end time prophecies.